aliens. Positively sure I'm absolutely mad about something. Oh, I'm positively sure I'm absolutely crazy too.
Hi, my name's Mark Stallow. Welcome to Little Green Man. This is the first in a 7-part series, just lifting the lid off the whole balance the budget doctrine that neoconservatives and neoliberals have been forcing down our throat for the last 30, 40 years, probably more. Balance the budget is something that everybody seems to agree is a good thing, but I'm going to show you that, and not only is it not a good thing, that it is actually can be incredibly disastrous thing. And it's a starting point to actually bring governments to its knees. Spoilers. Should have said that first. So what is balance the budget? What does that mean? Well, a balanced budget is you've got some public services that need to be paid for. You're running of government, you've also got roads, infrastructure, bridges, that kind of thing, healthcare, employment insurance, and all these kinds of things that must be paid for. There is a certain level of expense, and the government raises money for that with taxes, levies, payroll taxes, income tax, and so on. So you have a certain level of services. The government has revenue, income, the taxes and the levies and so forth. And the balance in the budget is that doctrine says that you have to, you cannot bring in any more money than you need to spend. You have to balance that budget. You can't spend more than that. You can't. And if you spend less, then you've got to cut your services so that budget is kept level. And that's balancing the budget. Now, what actually happens is, of course, that rarely is that are there too many taxes coming in, particularly with the outcry that comes along with the balance of the budget. The outcry is also cut taxes, cut taxes, cut taxes. And so you can't raise money when expenses go up, and expenses do go up for several legitimate reasons. And so when those expenses go up, then you have to bridge that gap of it. You've got to pay for it somehow. So you've got a choice. You cut the services or you raise the taxes. Third option is that you go into debt. And so everybody has been in this situation one way or another, that you have an expense you want to pay for. You need to buy a car. You need to buy a house. There's a gap there. You're not bringing enough money to buy one outright. So you take a loan. You go into debt. So we all do it, and we've all done it, and the majority of people are going to at least have a mortgage or a car loan. I think those things are pretty standard. Now, the talking point in all this is that businessmen balance the budget, therefore governments should as well. And therefore, that a businessman or a businesswoman should be employed by the government, elected into government, so they can run the government like a business and balance the budget. So that, in a nutshell, is what the balanced budget doctrine is about. So, but here's the big question, and it's coming up right here. Do businesses balance the budget? Well, we're told that families do it, and businesses do it, therefore governments must do it too. But think about your own family, your own income. What is, in that doctrine there of only spending in as much as you bring in and only bringing in as much as you need to spend is a joke. You don't do that. The only time that you curb your spending is when you're not bringing in enough money. Ideally, and everybody wants this, they want to be paid more so that they can have far more money coming in than they're spending, so they can save and they can, maybe have a few luxuries on top of the necessary expenses. Everybody wants to bring in more money. And funnily enough, there is not a single for-profit business that balances the budget. Think about that. I mean, it's obvious now I've said it out loud. For-profit businesses must bring in more money than its expenses, or it's not making a profit. It will cease to exist. And anybody who is running a business, a for-profit business, that comes in and says, we've got to cut our revenue to match our expenses, is actually probably wouldn't even get the job. And if he did get the job, he would be fired and ridiculed. And although he'd probably still get his golden parachute. But that's another issue. That's another video right there. So these are false equivalencies. Families don't do it and certainly don't want to do it, and businesses can't do it, otherwise they would be abject failures. So think of this. So let's put this now in government, in terms of running a government to balance the budget. So you cut the revenue. So taxes, if taxes are high, you cut the revenue to match your expenses. Businesses will never ever do that. Or you can cut your profits, or you can cut the products in a way that would affect your customer, which you're not going to do in a big way. You'll do it in a small way, so that incrementally, so they're not really going to notice. But you don't want to cut your product or your service so much that your customer says, this is garbage, I'm going somewhere else. So there's a balancing act. They want to raise as much money, and they can make as many cuts in their in the business as they can in their expenses, so they can maximize profits. So any cuts, any cuts to revenue will be considered a mass failure by the person or the people running such a business. And if they even get close to balancing their budgets, if they even get close, if those profits just drop even just a few percentage points, the chances are that the executive team are going to be fired by the board of directors or by the owner. So that would be abject failure. So why, now taking that into account, then why would businessmen be the perfect people to run a country, or a state, or a province, when they've never, ever, ever balanced their budget before? They have no experience in balancing the budget, and they've never, before you put the word government in there, have even considered it an option in business. So why do governments, does the neoconservative and the neoliberals want to force governments to do it? Well, in order to understand that, we now have to move into understanding what government debt is and how it's different from personal debt and different from business debt. But that is, and that's going to be in part 2, so stay tuned, that's coming up. Little Green Man. This is the back door to the Manitoba legislature. Now, if you hit the subscribe button now, hit the notification bell, then you won't be surprised when they try to stick something up your back door. Hi, my name is Mark Steller. Welcome to Little Green Man. This is part 2 in our 7-part series on the balanced the budget doctrine, which is more than about just balancing the budget, but it's where balancing the government budget will lead us, and how good this is not for us. So to understand the balance the budget lie is to understand what government debt is. Well, when governments need to borrow money, because income is less, so they're not bringing in enough money, when they need to borrow money, they sell bonds, and they sell bonds to private banks. These, of course, come with interest, that they'll sell the bond. When the bond matures, then they pay them the amount the bond was worth, plus interest. So it's very similar to a loan that you or I might take out for a car, or for the mortgage, or for a business, for that matter, might take out to increase, for whatever reason business need to borrow money. They certainly do at the beginning. And so in that respect, you borrow money, you pay interest back. But the difference is these government bonds are guaranteed by the state bank. So that we don't have that luxury as citizens and government and corporations and businesses don't have that luxury either, but governments do. So if you were to buy government bonds, you'd be guaranteed the interest at the end of it, regardless of how any market performs. So if inflation goes through the floor, then this would be guaranteed that they would have a relatively high interest rate. So it'll be guaranteed. Now, as a sidebar, this is important to know this before we move on. The private banks that lend the money to governments are actually privately owned by the same corporate network that owns all the other businesses. So these are private banks run by rich people, and many of these rich people will have their fingers in many other pies. But these people are the same people that we're hearing about who aren't paying a full amount of taxes. They get all these special loopholes thrown in into the law. They've gone out of their way to ensure that the corporate loopholes are in the tax law, so they can pay as little as possible. And there are offshore ways of hiding the money, and not going to go into that right now. But they're not paying their taxes, and we know they're not, and it's a big deal right across North America for sure, and right across Europe as well. So they're not paying their taxes. And so what we're doing by taking government bonds, and so rather than taking these bonds and borrowing money from the state bank and borrowing money from private companies, is effectively saying that these taxes that you're not going to pay, you can give us those taxes, and then when after the bonds mature, we'll give you back the same taxes you should have paid, plus we're going to give you a bit of interest. That's how it works. So it's kind of despicable in that respect. So how is government debt different from private debt? Well, actually, it's at a very high level, it's the same. I need money. I need money for a particular purpose. So I go to a bank, borrow the money, and I pay back interest. But that's kind of where it really stops being the same, because the government debt and private debt, and for that matter, private and business debt, is handled completely differently from government debt. Now, we'll look at this from a family's point of view. It'll be a little easier to understand when you borrow money from a bank to buy a car or maybe renewing your mortgage or whatever, that the higher your income is, the less of the interest rate you're likely to get, because you're more likely to pay off that debt quicker. So you get a good or a high credit rating. And if you lose your job and you're renewing your mortgage, say for instance, the chances are you might have to pay a higher interest rate if they'll even cover that. You certainly won't be. You certainly, if your credit rating is too low, then you won't be able to get a loan. You won't be able to buy a car, for instance. So that's how it works, and you've all experienced that, and that's very similar to how it works in business as well. But government is completely and utterly different. So when government raises revenue, so when it increases its income, when it raises taxes, its credit rating, instead of going up, because those loans there's no chance or a little chance that they're going to default on those loans, their credit rating actually goes down. It's the absolute opposite of what it is for a private or a business debt. Now, which is curious, so that when they raise taxes, their credit rating goes down and the interest goes up. So the private companies that are lending the money to the government get more money in return, which is kind of odd, which is the opposite way for you businesses. So why is that? Well, the reason for this is, and it's really quite simple. There are three main credit rating agencies that decide on the credit rating for governments. And these are privately owned companies, part of the same corporate network that own the banks, that own the corporations that are not paying, and the other corporations that are not paying their taxes, and that are benefiting, many of them benefiting from these government bonds. So when that happens, so they ensure that when if they were to raise taxes, so like that helps them to, they get the more interest, that encourages them to keep the taxes lower, so that at least lower for corporations and the rich people own them. But in the end, you end up paying the debt, more of the debt, so that they can get profit on not paying their taxes. So this is really weird. That it is kind of funny that we've got to this point, and you're probably asking yourself this question already: is why then do the people that are pushing for balancing the budget, particularly as the right wing are supportive of businesses and corporations and the rich people that own them, why do they hate debt? Well, I'm going to address that in the next video in part 3. So why do corporations hate debt? Why do neoliberals hate debt? Well, that's coming up. See you in part 3. This is the back door to the Manitoba legislator. Now, if you hit the subscribe button now, hit the notification bell, then you won't be surprised when they try to stick something up your back door.